Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming out in the rough weather. It's good to see to learn with all of you. The topic that we're focusing on is social justice. I guess kind of in the school we have an annual theme each year that shapes lots of the programming that occurs. Kind of in between and sometimes inside the classes. In recent years, themes have been anava, humility, dveikut, connection to God. This year, the theme is tzedek, and tzedek is a kind of a Hebrew word that we've chosen for social justice. Sometimes people use the term tikkun olam, and it felt. Even in terms of bringing this idea to the faculty and then to the students, to try to define exactly what it is they're trying to capture, takes some kind of focus, some kind of energy. There is a natural tendency to lump certain things together. So tzedek, or social justice, becomes quickly like all the nice things that we do. So chesed is also a nice thing, and tzedakah is also a nice thing, and tzedek is also a nice thing, and they all have to do with helping other people. But actually, in terms of trying to educate towards certain values and practices, it's important to try to first break them down and sort them out. So we start to spend some time with faculty and with students. Did a little bit of a different way into the theme. So the first part of what we're doing is actually a repeat for anybody who was here in the Yom Yun that we had, because in order for us to dig a little bit deeper into a topic, you got to first understand what the terms are. Then after we kind of understand what the category is a little bit more broadly, then we'll try to drill down a little bit into some subcategories. So if you look at the source, have to try to sort out what do we mean when we're talking about when we refer to chesed as opposed to tzedek as opposed to tzedakah. It is interesting. The first source is a Gemara that deals with the difference between tzedakah and chesed and gemilut chasadim. It is striking, right, and something that we should have in the back of our minds, that the Gemara doesn't have a category of tzedek or tikkun olam, that it also wants to understand its mindset. It says something in its absence, right? So just kind of keep in mind. But what is the difference between tzedakah and gemilut chasadim? Again, the Gemara is referring to the two things that we're not talking about. So the first source says, Tanu Rabbanan b'shlosha dvarim gdola gemilut chasadim yoter min tzedakah. There are three distinctions. In all three of these distinctions, gemilut chasadim comes out on top as being the stronger of the two. There are source sheets for anybody who does not yet have them on the table here. If I can just ask people to help get them around. So what are those three things? Tzedakah, first one is tzedakah is b'mimono. So how do you perform the mitzvah of tzedakah? With your mamon, with money. Gemilut chasadim, bein begufo, bein b'mono. You perform gemilut chasadim. Sometimes that involves an investment of money. It certainly involves an investment of your being. So what's an example of gemilut chasadim as opposed to tzedakah? If we imagine tzedakah, person, however that might look like, what is gemilut chasadim in a way that's different than that? Just as an example. The core cholim might be investing time in making that happen. Might be. So I would say that if you're delivering food to somebody else is going to take care of it. Gemilut chasadim, you're actually investing both, right? It doesn't have to be both. Actually, just yourself alone. It could be your money and yourself together, and for that reason, it actually makes it higher. So all those things, the list of things that fall into that category. Once you start with that, there's bikur cholim, and kind of you can kind of rattle off, I imagine, a list of other ways in which you can be helpful to another person using your guf. That's distinction number one. So gemilut chasadim is bein begufo, bein b'mono. Tzedakah, who do you give tzedakah? To whom does one give tzedakah? La'aniyim, to poor people. Gemilut chasadim, bein la'aniyim, bein la'ashirim. It also resonates, right? So chesed, helping, visiting somebody sick, has nothing to do with your economic status, right? You're just helping somebody out, and that's considered chesed, whether you're rich or you're poor. Tzedakah, the third distinction the Gemara says is l'chayim. Gemilut chasadim is bein l'chayim, bein l'meitim. Chesed Shalamet is the Chevra Kadisha, what they do, that's in the category of Chasadim. And so the Gemara compares Chesed and Tzedakah, and Chesed wins on all accounts, and the Gemara does not yet talk about anything that's Tzedek oriented. I want to again be clear that when we're using the word Tzedek, it's not a philological claim, right? It's sometimes like, just in case, this might not be, somebody might be thinking along these lines. Is that exactly what the word tzedek means? I'm not right now talking about what tzedek means. I'm talking about the way that the word tzedek is used, or tikkun olam is used today. What kinds of things is it referring to, so that we can then try to look at what does Judaism have to say about that category of stuff. So if that's true, you look at this Gemara, so then where's the social justice part of this? Does it exist? So we're going to circle back after to look at what the Gemara has to say about it. But scholars of Tanakh who say, well, does Judaism have a concept of social justice? There are many scholars who've written on it. The one who's written a book, is considered kind of the book on the topic, is Moshe Weinfeld, who's a professor of Tanakh, Bible, in Hebrew University. And he points to the following. It's okay. When God chooses Avraham Avinu, so when he chooses Avraham Avinu, he explains it's actually a moment. This moment in Perek Yudchet Pasuk Yutet is right after he appears to Avraham. It's right before Sodom happens, right before the story in Sodom happens. So this is actually an interesting setup, because he is chosen is this message, and you can see how the Sodom story following on the heels of this is actually very significant. He says, why did I choose you? What is it about you? What do I hope for you? What do I hope from you and all of your descendants? So the Pasuk, Breshit Yudchet Pasuk Yutet, is an understatement. It's almost in my mind like there are 10 commandments that we got at Har Sinai, and that's with Moshe Rabbeinu, and at that point in history, when Am Yisrael became a nation, this is kind of like the one commandment. If God told Avram anything, this is what I want from you. This is the category. Social justice might be important, that the 10 commandments are the 10 commandments. Avram Avinu got this message. What was he told? Ki dativ l'man asher yitzaveh banav et beito acharav, so that you should command your children and their children after. V'shamru derech Hashem lasot tzedakah u'mishpat, and they should guard the ways of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, lasot tzedakah u'mishpat, to fulfill these two things, tzedakah u'mishpat. What is tzedakah? What is tzedakah?
Tzedek is justice.
Tzedek is justice. So what's tzedakah here? Mishpat. Well, what's mishpat?
Mishpat is justice.
Justice. What's tzedakah?
Tzedakah is
Righteousness. Right.
Tzedakah, they'll translate it as righteousness. It is not by chance, given what we talked about in the Gemara. The Gemara is actually puzzled by this phrase. The Gemara sees this as an oxymoron. Why is this an oxymoron? Tzedakah mishpat. The Gemara actually asks the question like that. This is an oxymoron. They don't use that word. They say b'makom sheyesh mishpat ein tzedakah. Makom shel tzedakah ein mishpat. What do they mean by that? Why is that true?
Midas chesed and midas rachamim is as opposed to midas mishpat.
If you are a judge in a courtroom and you're judging based on mishpat, you could arrive at one decision, and if you're judging based on tzedakah, you could arrive at a different decision. So how can you fulfill both of these at the same time? So the Gemara asks that question. The Gemara gives two different answers. I'll say one of the answers the Gemara gives, which is, this is an oft-quoted Gemara. Our kids learn this in 11th grade. The Gemara says that this is the tzedakah and mishpat. How do you do both of them? Pshara. Pshara is the word for, it's both the Gemara word and the contemporary word for arbitration. So, and you think about what's the goal of arbitration. The idea is to find some way in which we can solve this issue which has some measure of justice in it, but is actually rooted in an attempt for us to be able to figure out how to get along. That's Gemara's answer to that question. Moshe Weinfeld says that is a Gemara answer to that question, but that's not what the Tanakh means. If you look at where tzedakah mishpat appears, and he points to hundreds of others, but I'm just going to bring one other example where tzedakah mishpat is. Now, you looked at everywhere that they use the term tzedakah mishpat in Tanakh. So David HaMelech is the other person. Vayimloch David al kol Yisrael vayi David oseh mishpat u'tzedakah l'chol amo. David HaMelech did mishpat u'tzedakah, and you can imagine that the Gemara, in its way, what's the question the Gemara asks? If you learn Gemara, why does it say tzedakah mishpat u'tzedakah? And the Gemara asks that question, answers it. If you're a Tanakh learner, his answer, it doesn't matter. Tzedakah mishpat tzedakah is the same thing. I don't mean if you're a Tanakh learner. I mean if you're a Bible scholar trying to get the culture, if you have that orientation to it. And if you look now, you see that somehow my end of the previous pasuk, I see, got cut and added on to the end of this line. So if you're confused about why Abraham appears in Shmuel Bet, that is a typo. So I mean, it jumped somehow. So he says, well, what does it mean that David HaMelech, right? David HaMelech is praised for doing mishpat u'tzedakah. What does it mean? So Moshe Weinfeld's claim, and this is, I think, the common thinking, is, if you look at the next source, he says the concept of social justice was expressed in ancient Israel and in the ancient Near East by means of a hendiades. So hendiades, I fumbled last time, right? The hendiades is when you have two words that mean one thing. Sometimes you have one concept and you will refer to the two things together, refer to the one thing using kind of a term. If I put one of those things out there, right, if you say that the coffee that you are drinking is nice and hot, right, you don't mean by that it is nice and it's also hot, right? You're trying to kind of convey, any of those, if you're Saturday Night Live, any of those things which are, it's not this and it's not this, like discuss, it's one of those, Saturday Night Live fans here. Okay, it's a concept, a singular concept that is reflected in two words. So how does that help us? What is mishpat u'tzedakah mean?
Like a synonym?
No. What is a synonym? A synonym is when you have two words that mean the same thing.
Right.
This is not two words that mean the same thing. This is a singular concept. Well, the difference, the way it's not, I'll say they each modify each other. In other words, when you have a modifier, you'll have one word that modifies the other. Here you have two words. They mutually define each other in a certain kind of way. Right? They're complementary and they work together. Should I risk putting that out there again for another an example of of a thing like that? How are you? It's the idea of
Cut and dry.
what?
Cut and dry.
Perfect. Cut and dry is a perfect example, right? So what is the? It is a perfect example because it's if meaning it's actually sharper because it's not about modifying. That's exactly it actually helps, not hurts. The idea of cut and dry is you are conveying a certain kind of I mean, you might be right if you're hesitating. You might be right that if you went to the etymology, how you got to cut and dry to mean cut and dry, you might get it's an it right. So it's fair. Okay, so do you get the point though?
It's an idiom.
Do we get the idea? Mishpat u'tzedakah. How does that mean social justice? It means that as opposed to just living by the law, it's this is the law and that's it. We need to establish a law that operates with a mode of compassion. That there's some kind of understanding in terms of how the law works. Let's read the end of the sentence, and I'll try to give an example of what I think is the classic example of a mishpat u'tzedakah kind of society. It says the most common word pair to serve this function in the Bible is mishpat u'tzedakah, justice and righteousness, or tzedakah mishpat, righteousness and justice. That's what he says. So now, the point here is going to be that if you say, what is... Know that the Gemara talks a lot about tzedakah, and the Gemara talks a lot about chesed. We don't really find so clearly the Gemara talking about tzedek, certainly not tikkun, not any of those phrases, not even, or you'll have to work hard to find it exactly in concept, and that's part of what we're going to work on, to try to figure out whether and where that exists. In Tanakh, you clearly do find it, and you find it in the term mishpat tzedakah or tzedakah mishpat. That's the idea. What is an example to kind of get a flavor of what it means to establish a society? Does anybody have a gut about what in our, maybe I'll say in our maybe I'll say in the economic, kind of think of the economics of the Torah. Is there anything that suggests, so it's interesting actually. Does leket strike you as tzedakah, chesed, or I don't know. We're going to play with these a little bit. I'm not going to decide right now, but okay, you can put leket on the table. Something else? Just for putting things out there.
Taking care of the widow and the orphan.
Taking care of the widow and the orphan, which is not an example, but it's the example, but it's not a concrete, what's a way in which it plays out. So we're going to get back to the widow and the orphan in a second, because that is tzedakah mishpat in Tanakh. The example would be, Shemitah is a good example. The debt, cancellation of debts is a prime example, and if you're reading, there have been various articles in the paper this year about debt reduction. This is not a value statement, right? And I want to be kind of clear, Meirosh. I don't know what the breakdown in the room is of Democrats and Republicans and other people, and we should really kind of get to some of that stuff in its broadest strokes. Right? It's not going to be political to us, but it's going to be like. But what we shouldn't do, I don't think is right, is to I think that whichever side you fall, you have to kind of be willing to look at strong comparisons to what we can contemporarily or conventionally call social justice. The other places where you don't actually see it. The idea of debt reduction seems to be certainly an example of something like that. Another example of what I would give, and then we can move on a little, is loans in general, actually. And it's not by chance, it's loans again. And the pasuk is quite explicit about it. The pasuk says when you lend money, so the traditional strategy, right? If I'm going to lend somebody $1,000, so I say, okay, I'll lend you $1,000. What do I want in return?
Interest.
Well, interest is what. Yeah, I wasn't going to get into that. Interest,
take it from
yes,
Jews,
100%.
okay.
And that is an example of what that means. Yes, I wanted to give another example of loans, but that's actually a great example too. You asked for collateral. So what's the collateral? Who determines? There are two laws I think are focused on in terms of the laws of collateral. If I am lending you $1,000 and say, I'd like something to hold on to in the interim. So logic dictates that who gets to determine the collateral that you are going to give me? The lender should have the right to choose the collateral. The pasuk is very explicit. It says, it's a bizarre pasuk unless you think about what it's trying to say. It says, "Bachutz ta'amod," the lender has to stand outside. And the person who you are lending the money to, he's going to bring you the mashko, he's going to bring you the collateral outside. It's like, what is that about? So if you think about imagine your garage for a second, and you know exactly what it's about. If I have to give somebody $1,000 worth of collateral, I got much more than that in my garage that I don't want. I'd be happy to give that as collateral. So worst comes to worst, I'm going to lose something that I don't really care about that much. Am I allowed to do that? Yes. Well, why not would be, well, I actually don't want, I'm sorry, I'm switching eyes here. I, the lender, don't want to lend you the money unless I know that I have something that I care about. Now, what the Torah is saying is, b'chutz ta'amod, and then the Torah says, and he'll bring out the collateral to you. The Torah also says, lo tishkav ba'avoto, right? If he needs it at night, you should return it to him. And then the words that the Torah uses at the end is, ulchat hiya tzedakah, right? Ubeiracheka. This should be tzedakah for you, and God will bless you. And those three psukim in Chumash, I still remember when I was teaching at SAR Academy, 8th grade Chumash, and I did not know how to, they were bizarre. It's like, if I read this like a yeshiva guy, it's like, nothing against yeshiva guys. When you read it like Mefarshim, you don't understand, you gotta like, okay, how do I make this understandable to a kid in school? So and then you start digging a little bit, and you read how, if you're coming out of a certain orientation, that's what they're trying to communicate. That's something really powerful. Now, that is a classic example of mishpat tzedakah, I would say. Because you're establishing a law, but you're establishing a law that's not judgment-like law. It's compassionate law. With the Torah, with God saying, "Don't worry, I'm going to take care of you in the end if it works out." That's kind of the concept. So I don't want to get too. I want to kind of move along because that can be kind of a sheer in its own. But if that's so, that's kind of an example. That's a third category. Now, if it's true that in Tanakh you have that as a that's where you find the idea of social justice. So where do you see it repeated over and over again? So now I'll get to who's the object of, we said actually before, this is really worth focusing on. You see how you can tease the things apart. I never, I was only thinking about this, I started to kind of break it out in that kind of way. Who's the object of tzedakah? Sorry for using object, but that's a little part of the problem. Who's the object of tzedakah? Who's the recipient of tzedakah? I should say if that's nicer. Yes, the Jewish issue is also an issue, right? But let's just say a poor person right now. Who's the object? Who is the recipient of chesed? Anybody. Who's the recipient of chesed? Anybody. Who is the target when it comes to mishpat and tzedakah in Tanakh? So the terms that are used, what's the term? There is, so those actually both are good. Sometimes you'll find achicha, find that, and sometimes you'll find lots of talk about ger yatom v'almana. Now, are there parshiot, are there units in Chumash to talk about giving tzedakah to poor people? Absolutely. That's not, ger yatom v'almana is the thing that we talk about. We're talking about when the Nevi'im talk about the idea of righteousness. When we read Haftorah Yom Kippur about what it means to take care of the people, they're talking about ger yatom v'almana. Now, who is that? Is that the same or different? I initially, with that thing, it's like ger yatom v'almana.
They're the weak members of society.
Are they the poor members of society? Not necessarily poor. And that's the point that I really want to focus on. I think that that's important. And here, I'm going to ask you to read the next. I'm going to read the next paragraph. Peter Brown is he is the historian of Christian society and antiquity in kind of Roman, pretty much Roman society and Roman Christian society. So he has a book on poverty and leadership where he describes. He says as follows: in the Near Eastern model of society, the poor, this is an elegant, I think, description, were a judicial, not an economic category. I had to think about that for the kind of reorient. Does it mean the poor are a judicial category? What do you think that means?
The lack of access.
And therefore what? Yeah, what do you do? Meaning, what are they missing? What are they lacking? Connections, yeah. Status, connections, ability to have their day in court, to be able to connect to the people who have the power. That's the ger yatom v'almana. They might or might not be poor. Probably likely, right? The richer you are, the less, right? We can play this out in our contemporary society, right? And imagine the ways in which they overlap or don't exactly overlap. Also, because that's both, right? Meaning, I think that I'd only say that they're not precisely the same, although often they overlap, which I think is true today too. They're not precisely the same, but often they would overlap. They were plaintiffs, not beggars. To give justice to the poor was a sign of royal energy, whether this was the energy of a king or of a god. It was an attribute of royalty that was displayed most fully on the accession of the ruler. For in giving such justice, I'm supposed to scroll my page down here a little bit. For in giving such justice, the new king showed the reach of his power. He deliberately brushed aside intermediate authorities, local oligarchies, local patrons, heads of families, so as to deal directly with those who had been deprived of all protectors but himself. Hence the importance in the representations of royal justice of the appeals of widows and orphans. They were a class of the weak, who in normal circumstances would have depended on the protection of their immediate kin and locality. That basically encompasses both definitions, right? In other words, why ger yatom v'almana? Because your family isn't taking care of you. Why is your family usually taking care of you? Because the Torah says, take care of all your achichas. Those are kind of complementary concepts, right? The achicha and the ger yatom v'almana kind of thing. Now the king stepped in to take up their case. What is interesting is that this is an ancient Near Eastern idea in general, as opposed to a Greek idea. We're actually going to, at some point later on, see how the Greeks saw the city in a way in which they saw it very differently than the ancient Near Eastern world, even the non-Jewish, right, in the ancient Near Eastern world. The criticism of ancient Near Eastern kings is that they would forgive debts Like the scholars will say that all the categories of our Shemitah and all those things appear in ancient Near Eastern law. Kings did that when they rose to power because that showed that they really cared, and then they the criticism is, and they forgot about it afterwards. And the difference between the Jewish concepts and the ancient Near Eastern concepts was that the biblical ancient Near Eastern concepts were, it's not the king, it is the king. Who's telling you to do that? It's a God that's kind of man. It's almost like taking those ideas and making sure that they're really incorporated into society in a very powerful and consistent kind of way. So, in order to obtain, but that's also just interesting in terms of, it is a distinctly Jewish idea in a certain sense, but it is an ancient idea that actually, depending on your perspective, well, let's say it changed afterwards and then kind of circled back to come back a little bit. In order to obtain such justice from above, the petitioner had to adopt the position of the poor, that is, of a person with no other protector but the king. This did not mean that he or she was economically destitute. Rather, the poor person was the person of any status who waited humbly but insistently for the answer of the great. Can you, like this, I feel like these sentences resonate contemporarily really strongly. As you can imagine, people for whom this is true. You deal with you're the person who's got to deal with the bureaucracy, and you don't know how to do it. And other people who are better connected are like, what do you mean? What's your problem? People just go and ask them. But I can't. So it's very, very similar. To be poor.
Israel is called protexia.
Yeah, right. Yes. Yeah, exactly. To be poor was to have a claim. The monumental clarity and poetic elegance of the juxtaposition of ze'akah and tzedakah. You can look up the pasuk in Yeshayahu, but the ze'akah and tzedakah are written in parallel because one is a response to the other. The response to ze'akah is to do tzedakah. Now that, if you get the feeling, is a very different kind of concept than just straight up stucco. This I'll ask you to turn to the next page. So we're trying to kind of chart out what the difference is between these three ideas. The first two columns, the right and the middle, are the Gemara's, and then the third is what we're doing. Tzedakah is your money to the poor, and you're doing it for people who are living. Gmilut Chasadim is with your body, and maybe with your money, for rich or for poor, and it applies to Chaim Meitim. What's the definition of Mishpat Tzedakah as we are defining it? I should have probably written Mishpat Tzedakah on the top for accuracy. In the Tanakh, it's about the king, which I'll say parallels the way we think about social justice in lots of ways, which is it has to do with impacting the political structures of things. It's not about giving. It's not about giving. It's the question of whether you believe, a big part of the question of whether you're a supporter of an idea of social justice or not. And the reason why it becomes political the way that it becomes political is because we think about social justice in terms that involve government. And the question is whether government should get involved in things like that. That's the question on the table. I don't, so on the one hand, I would say, without feeling like this is the end of the conversation, is there a role for the government in terms of these kinds of things in the Jewish world? And I would say the answer is yes in Tanakh. I don't think that that is then the final answer about whether we believe in social justice. Great, that's it. Although it's not a question that there are, right, if you are believing in social justice, you point to Tanakh and you say, you see, I got plenty of basis for it. That's where it comes from. Number one is that difference. It's about politics. Number two, it's the Ger Yatom Almana. That's a different population, which is the people who don't have a voice. They want to have a claim, and it's our job to hear. Sorry, that was very hierarchical. Not everybody's job. I don't know if I have the claim, but I didn't mean our. Right? The people who have the power have the responsibility to listen to the cries of people who don't. That's a second thing. A third is that when we think, now this is where we're going to other aspects of the Tanakh, when we talk about the Shemitah and the Yovel and the loans and the stuff like that, there is an element of, and this is true when we talk about it as social justice, there's a distributive element to social justice when we talk about it. This is not, again, I'm just going to stop apologizing for this. So it's not about whether it's right or wrong yet, it's about what it is. When we talk about social justice, we're talking a lot about, do we believe in redistribution of wealth in a way that's going to be able to kind of level things out in some measure, which again has its some basis in things like Shemitah, Yovel, etc. Now, I'm going to skip the next two things and kind of move to the bottom, but first maybe I'll make a small point about it. I want to Now, thinking about this raises a number of questions, not all of which we'll be able to deal with. But if you think about, one of the questions that social justice raises that tzedakah and chesed don't. Tzedakah and chesed are apple pie in terms of like this, is there anybody who doesn't believe in tzedakah and chesed? No. Are there any, right by the Jewish community fighting about whether tzedakah and chesed are good things? No. But there are arguments about whether social justice is a good thing. So what are the questions that are raised by, if I ask you to kind of shift gears to contemporary social justice kinds of things, what are the questions that are raised that are worth arguing about, that social justice champions, that we should probably, it's argued about because you got to think about it. What are some of those things? Yes?
It sometimes comes into conflict with freedom, especially economic freedom.
So there is the right, meaning the kind of the, I think I had to categorize these because there's like, in my mind at least, there are categories with some things. Now, if I have my hard-earned wealth, and I have my right to my hard-earned wealth to figure out what it is that I want to do with it. I might even have my own obligations that I have, but they're my obligations. Right, so the question is a question about someone else's right to make decisions about and that's a clear social justice-y kind of question. Does the government have a right to be able to take something away?
As well as the impact that would have on incentive.
And then it's right.
As in governments that have failed because people have no incentive
right.
to.
Right.
So
you're going to redistribute.
Self-perpetuating, let's say, poverty, food stamps, or welfare. Is that
Dependent, right? No, dependents are certain kinds of things, right? Personal responsibility types of things. Okay, good.
But how about
Let's see.
The concept of equality.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying in my mind. I want to make sure that I can kind of. This can get unwieldy quickly, not the conversation, but it can get in terms of like maintaining our focus. Because for me, I want to focus on a couple of different topics as we kind of move through. One of them for sure is kind of what the role is of someone else to make a decision about my wealth. And I actually, before I get to the equality thing, some subcategories that Judaism will have something to say about that. Well, what would make governments, somebody else have the right to make a decision? What, as a Jew, there actually are some things that might have someone else have a right to say something about my wealth. Why? Well, I don't know. I mean, God might have something to say. If God said something about, if God had something to say about my wealth, I would have to listen. Let me get a little bit more kind of. The way that I want to think about it, at least for now, and I'm not dealing with these now, I just want to raise them, then you can raise some other things also. But there is a theology question around the poor and around wealth, which we will see is very different religions and societies think about it differently. If somebody's poor, is that bad or good? Well, in our society, if you're poor, it's bad. In some religious societies, if you're poor, it's good. What's an example of a religious society where being poor was good? Well, Jesus thought being poor was good. And Christians actually thought that being poor. So I'm not at the point yet of saying like, well, that's them and we're different. I want to just think for a second that what you think about poverty is significant in terms of how you think you're supposed to deal with it. That's also relevant to the equality issue. Does the Torah actually think that everybody's supposed to be equal? No. I can believe in tzedakah and chesed, and the idea of saying that our push is to push for equality. Who said that that's true?
It says they'll always be poor.
From the psukim, it sounds like they'll always be. So we think we have. I think we have to. I just want to again raise them as puzzle pieces, right? The idea of thinking about our gut instinct, which is a healthy instinct in terms of care, is to say that when people are poor, we should try to help them so that they aren't poor. That doesn't necessarily mean that all of the strategies that have ever been put forward to solve that problem are the right problem. Communism didn't work out so well. The idea of saying, and it might be that it's a problem that can't be solved. It might be it's a problem that God doesn't want to be solved. It might be that God wants us to do the best we can with it. It might be that God wants us to all like the idea of being poor. Meaning all of those have been positions that have been put on the table, right? So for us, we have to think about that. Another thing that's going to come up is, when we talk about theology, is if somebody is given a certain lot, if you believe in divine providence, then your decision to change that is significant. Now you'll say, well, we go to doctors? And the answer to that is, there have been people who said you shouldn't go to doctors, and there have been Jewish texts which said you shouldn't go to doctors, and that's a question that needs to be dealt with. So I want to stop with this. I just wanted to raise the categories. But the categories we are raising are the role of government as kind of a large category. Is equality actually a real goal in Judaism? Rights versus obligations. Is it, do I have a right to my wealth? Do I have obligations around my wealth? Who makes those obligations? Is it true that poor people have rights to certain things, which social justice people will say yes? Does Judaism say that?
We have obligations. We're supposed to give 10% or 20% of your wealth to the poor.
I will only say one sentence right now. Saying that I have an obligation to give money and saying that someone else has the right to receive money are two dramatically different concepts. And so, and in a certain respect, that is very much what's at stake in the conversation. America speaks very, we'll get back to this, speaks very much in terms of rights. Rights means that everybody has a right to a certain, that pushes in a certain direction. Does this make sense? That rights push in a certain direction. Obligations is something very different. They could both be geared towards the same goal. A goal which might or might not be equality. I mean, that's exactly what I'm trying to say, right? We want to care about other people. That might mean people have a right to it. It might mean we have an obligation to it. It might mean that the goal is equality. It might mean that the goal can't possibly or shouldn't be equality. What was I going to say? It might be that being poor is a terrible thing. It might be that being poor is not such a terrible thing if our mindset changes. All of these are building blocks that when you sort them out can let you arrive at very different places in terms of what should we be doing. So that's kind of a general frame. What I'd like to do first, just for today, okay, is to try to deal with one aspect that has not been raised yet in this list. And that is, when we think about these kinds of things, how do we think about the personal versus impersonal side of performing those acts? When you're doing something for somebody else, is it better to do that personally, or is it better to do that impersonally? And yes, I'm sorry, I'm saying impersonally because in my mind I'm thinking about institutions in addition to anonymous, right? Because one of the things that happens, and this is, I will say, a question that comes up to me educationally as I kind of think of us taking on this topic, is that you can spend your entire life involved in social justice efforts and not interact with any people actually who are suffering, because your whole life is on, I don't know, Capitol Hill lobbying for this or that, or you're working in healthcare, and so you're working on all these kinds of categories. And so one of the things is I actually can teach kids that they're doing good things by worrying about or raising money for doing something on the other side of the world. But actually there's a trade-off in terms, if we think about it in terms of real economies of time, we can say there are lots of things that are good. But if, it's like, if you won't mind the analogy, right, when the Netziv, when the Volozhin Yeshiva closed down because of the Russian government forced them to put secular studies into this kind of a big debate about why the Netziv said that it was either put in, incorporate general studies into your program or close the school. We said, then close the school. So there's one conclusion that one can draw, which scholars say is not true, which is the Netziv thought that secular studies were a bad thing. You should only study Jewish things. There's another conclusion, which apparently is Netziv's conclusion, which is, I can think secular studies are a good thing, but in this yeshiva, for the 5 years they're spending it, you need to know Torah because that's the only time you're going to learn it, and if you don't do it, you're going to lose some. I'm sorry for that far-off analogy, but what I mean by that is you can have two things that you think are good. At the end of the day, if you try to do them, that's an accusation on a school like this, honestly, right? It's like, it's great that you try to do all these things, but it's also not great that you try to do all these things, because when you try to do all these things, you try to do too many things, it's hard to do them all at the same time. So I have an educational question about doing, if you're teaching kids about social justice, maybe it would be better, it's important for them to have sensitivity out there. Maybe it's more important for them to actually encounter people who are really suffering and engage in them. That relates to a question of whether it's important to, better to give anonymously, better to give in person, like is there a how which I'm going to say relates back to some of the other questions too. If all we care about is a poor person's life and getting better, my rule in it doesn't matter that much. It's a matter of what the result is. But who says that that's all that it's about? That's the first thing I want to raise, yeah.
But isn't that question bringing us right back to tzedakah versus social justice? Giving anonymously versus giving individually, that's giving. That's a tzedakah issue. That's not a social justice, which is a redistribution issue.
I would say that I think that there's one variable in thinking about how to. The reason why I kind of bring it in here is because I think that one lends its. I think both are relevant to both. You can give tzedakah anonymously. You can give tzedakah personally. You can do social justice when you are kind of helping people in a very immediate. When people who are involved in certain causes are involved in very hands-on kinds of ways. People involved in very distant kinds of ways. So I am asking you to kind of step back from the immediate. So, you're right. You're right. It's almost like I would say, yeah, I just want to explore the question anyway. I mean, it's like because I think that it's relevant to how we. For me, it's stemming from what I suspect, what I sometimes feel is a focus. So I'll try this sentence to tell if this makes sense to you. That there are a lot of people who care a lot about social justice and don't really do a whole lot of things. They just care a lot about social justice. I read articles, I read, I say whatever I say, and I'm not doing so. But that's a pit. No, that's not. That's your whole point. That's not. But that's not the right. But that's not the whole point. The point is to consider that, to make that a live factor that I just want to kind of pay attention to. So not every. I want to do like this: raise kind of large questions, then put them aside a little bit so that we can actually learn a little bit also, and then bring them back again. So I don't think that the fact that that's a problem makes all of social justice obviously wrong. It makes it something that we got to consider in terms of when we champion social justice. There's a danger, there's a something that we have to think about when we're doing it. So at any rate, I wanted to pay a little bit of attention to it. So at this point, I'm going to ask this. We're shifting gears entirely right now for a second to the follows. We're on the bottom of page 2 where it says tu sugyot. So if you can put all that to the side right now and almost like kind of start again. If we put Tanakh aside and want to learn Torah Baal Peh. So in the Gemara talks a lot about, and when I mean put it to the side, I'm saying put all the social justice to the side, because what I decided to do is my interest, as it turned out, was that the Gemara, in the Gemara, there are 2 sugyot that deal with tzedakah. And as you said, they deal only with tzedakah. That's what they're dealing with. But they still will be relevant, as we'll see. So the topic of social justice, we could spend all 4 days just learning Tanakh. I don't want to do that because this is just my interest right now. So what I did want to pay attention to was one of the 2 sugyot in the Gemara. There are 2 places that there is a topic of tzedakah. One is in Masechet Ketubot, and one is in Masechet Bava Batra. And the thing that I'd like to do just to get us started is to read these 2 Mishnayot, because in the context of the Mishnah, there's something very powerful. You see, premeditated in a certain sense of the way in which the Gemara placed the discussions, where it placed the discussion in respect to Masechta. I'll tell you what I mean. So the first Mishnah, Masechet Ketubot, says as follows: Hamesi et bito stam. If somebody marries off his daughter, lo yifchot la mi-50 zuz. You have to give at least 50 zuz, 200 dinar. That's whatever X number of tens of thousands of dollars to be able to support the process. V'chein hamesi et hayitoma. Somebody who marries off, who helps the yitoma marry, right? So we're on topic now in terms of the yitoma, right? And if it's a meisiyat hayitoma, the person does not have a family, which means that this is falling on other people to support that enterprise. Lo yifchot la mi-50 zuz. You have to also give the 50 zuz. Miyesh bekis v'farnesim ota l'fi chvoda. And if you have more than that, then you're supposed to give l'fi chvoda, in accordance with her honor. The Gemara here then goes on and has a lengthy discussion about the mitzvah of tzedakah, in which it talks about the various expectations and challenges of giving tzedakah. And as you can tell from the last line, what is the obligation to give tzedakah to a person? If you remember the pasuk in Chumash, it says the obligation to give tzedakah is dei machsoro. What does dei machsoro mean? What the person is missing, which basically means even if the person lived on a relatively high, had a relatively high standard of living. The obligation of tzedakah is to get that person back to that standard of living. That is about dignity and all that. Okay. Now, the entire discussion of the Gemara, there is one discussion of tzedakah in Masechet Ketubot. There was a second, and we ask people that, okay, where's the other? They'll say, if you kind of learn the topic, and lots of schools sometimes learn this topic, there's a sugya in Baba Basra and Dazayan of Bet, Daf Yud Alef and Aleph. It's the sugya of tzedakah. Look at the context of this Gemara. It says, this Mishnah, Kofimo tolu not Beit Sha'ar v'delet l'chatzir. This is the last source on page 2. This is a Mishnah, just to give you a sense of what's going on in this parak. This is the topic of the parak in Baba Basra, is what we would call Hilchot Shchenim, as the Rambam categorizes it. Hilchot Shchenim, the law of neighbors. The laws of neighbors have to do with how do people who are living in the same kind of in close proximity, how do they get along? What?
Shared space.
Shared space. So the first Mishnah talks about what are their obligations to build, kind of good fences make good neighbors, that kind of thing. So if good fences make good neighbors, so the first Mishnah deals with the following thing. I think good fences make good neighbors, so I say let's build a fence. Except that my neighbor thinks that having free open space is what makes for good neighbors. They don't want to build a fence. So the Mishnah is talking about who wins. Can one person force somebody else to build a fence? That's Mishnah number 1. Mishnah here is talking about a group. This is kind of an apartment, kind of a set of a row of what's the term I'm looking for? A complex. Thank you. Right, and they want to build a gate. That's called a delet. They want to kind of have a door. This door is closed. They want to have it closed, and they want to have a beit sha'ar. The beit sha'ar is a bayit for the sha'ar. That means one of those things where the guard will sit in and make sure that everybody is checked before they come in. So the question that the Mishnah is dealing with is, you have 30 families who live in this complex, and it's going to cost X amount of money to pay for it. So you're going to levy, right? There's the Mishnah time is saying, can you raise that as an issue? Or you want to put up a door, and you want to put up a beit sha'ar, and some people like it, and some people don't like it. So who wins? So the Mishnah's orientation is, it really depends on whether something is considered to be a basic need. If this is like normal living, these are the halacha standards. Like the halacha about a wall is, do I have a right to privacy? So if I have a right to privacy, then if I want the wall and you don't want the wall, but we believe that people have a right to some basic privacy, then the fact that I want the wall wins. If we both agree you don't want the wall, you don't have to put up the wall. But we both agree that you do. So basically what the Mishnah is doing in these kinds of things is setting up what are the basic standards that and kind of rights of common dwellers. So this is a security question. What level of security do people have a right to make a claim for? And the assumption here is not majority rules. The assumption is what are kind of reasonable expectations. So the Mishnah says, beit sha'ar v'delet l'chatzir. People that force each other to build a gate and a door and a place for the security guard. Not all chatzirot need a beit sha'ar. Shimon Gamliel disagrees. The Mishnah goes on then to talk about it on a kind of a municipal level. It says, you can also force the town to build a wall around it, and everybody's got to pay in. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, well, you should do an assessment first. Some towns actually need it, some towns don't need it. So you can imagine how this machloket tanaim is actually extremely important in terms of figuring out how kind of communities work together, how they're supposed to kind of make things happen. Turn the page. What does this have to do with tzedakah? Nothing. The fact that it has nothing to do with tzedakah is what makes it so beautiful in terms of the Bavli's kind of maneuver here, and how they then end up spending, out of the 3.5 daf sugya, 2.5, almost 3 out of 3.5 dafs of the sugya have to do with tzedakah. Yes?
How do you enforce this?
How do you enforce this? So there are rules about not dissimilar that you would have kind of your local courts who could do it. So what exactly what was the judicial side, and what was the kind of the what role, what kind of policing they had, I can't say. But they are assuming very similar kinds of problematics, things they have to work out, and with the structure to be able to support it. Turn the page, please, to the Gemara on the next slide. So here the Gemara says as follows. The sugya begins as follows. Lememra, do you mean to say debate sha'ar ma'al yutahi? This is page 3 at the top. Lememra, it says Gemara first, it says, Lememra debate sha'ar ma'al yutahi. You mean to tell me that having a gate is a good thing? And the Gemara attempts to contradict this Mishnah with a story. V'ahu chasida da'havi ragil Eliyahu da'havi mishtay ba'adei. There was a chassid, right? Not like what we call chassidim, right? But a kind of, you know, right, one of those. Yes, a devout, right? What?
Not a store.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a term that's not coming to my head. Okay, but a pious person who Eliyahu Hanavi used to appear to that person every day. Eliyahu would appear to him every day.
Come to me yet.
Right. Meaning, and that's the madrega of this person. And then what happened? Avad Beit Sha'ar. And then the person decided that he was going to build a gate around his complex. V'tulo mishtay ba'adei. And Eliyahu stopped showing up. That's the Gemara's question. That sounds like a Beit Sha'ar is a bad idea. If Eliyahu Hanavi stopped showing up because he built a security gate around their complex. Any ideas on what the problem is? What's so bad about that?
Kept out the poor.
Shutting yourself off from the world.
Which world in particular? So all the commentaries say, and that's clear, and where they get it from is without a doubt what happens for the next 3 daf in Gemara. You're keeping the poor people out. In other words, why is Eliyahu? Eliyahu doesn't care about whether, I mean, he should care about the security or not. He can do the protecting, right? That's Eliyahu. So it's kind of striking. Eliyahu, who's the big protector, right? So what's the problem? The problem is that there's a trade-off in security. Do you have a right to security? You have a right to security. But when you make things too secure, you're losing something else, at least in this particular setting. What you're losing is the opportunity to take care of the poor. That's the Gemara's question. The Gemara's answer is lo kasha. It's not a question. And then the Gemara gives this again. I love this Gemara because it's one of those things that if you just read it, it's like, you know, it gives 4 answers to this question, but you get the flow of the thing. Lo kasha, hami gavai, hami broi. One case is talking about when it's inside, one case is talking about when it's outside. What does that mean? So if you use your imagination, you can imagine that there's a fence and there's a guard there. Now, if the fence is like this and the guard is right there, then you've closed everybody out. But if there is space for the guard, he's going to check you, and then you can, or you can actually come in, and then the guard is going to check you inside, right? You know the difference, right? You can imagine between when you go in and there's a guard on the inside of the building as opposed to a guard on the outside of the building. The guard on the inside of the building is communicating as something, right, that's what we're communicating. You're welcome to come in, we just want to make sure that everything is okay. A guard on the outside of the building is, you're not welcome to come in. And if you think of different spaces, right, you can see, public spaces versus certain places, you see that that's, in some sense that's true. So if that's true, so if you do it one way, bad. Because pretty much what's in normal sentence, what's the Gemara trying to say? You have to you're entitled to your security. But if your security is coming at the price of the poor people being able to come and ask for support from you, Eliyahu's not showing up anymore, that's it. And the Gemara then gives 5 things. I'll just read it through for that. Or both of them are when it's kind of closed, when it's closed. V'lo kasha, hadi'itle delet, hadiletle delet. Because if you imagine walled cities, and into these walled cities, so what are the walled cities? They're walled, and then there's the Beit Sha'ar, and then sometimes there are doors, and sometimes there are not doors. So if you don't have a door, then the guy can come in. A potachat is a doorknob. If there's a doorknob, then it's also okay, right? And you read the Gemara and you laugh, kind of, but it's like, no, I get what they're saying. Either way, there's a handle, but you know what the question is? Lo kasha ha depotachat didei migavoy, ha depotachdei mibroi. Which side is the handle on? If the handle's on the inside, that's wrong. If there's a handle on the outside, that's okay. This is the Gemara in the Gemara's classic way. It's like beautiful and how different it is than where he would say it, of saying the first sentence that it wants to say is, are you entitled to your security? Yes. Are you allowed to force your colleagues, your community members, to pay for security? The answer is yes. However, what is also your responsibility as a community? To let the poor in. Now, the reason why this is so significant and that it's on this Mishnah is that what is clear, and we're going to see when we do further tomorrow, is that there are two sugyot. One Masechet Ketubot. What does Ketubot deal with? What's it about? Marriage. Marriage. And what's the specific example of the Mishnah talking about? Achnasas kala, right? If anybody is, if you're asking for tzedakah, right? How many times are you asking for achnasas kala? That's the kind of tzedakah. What's the Mishnah about Basra talking about? Hilchos Shchenim, talking about communities and cities. And both of those are in this Mishnah. Security for communities, security for cities. And what is he talking about? What does the Gemara then do? It's not the Mishnah. What does the Gemara then do? Mishnah talking about tzedakah. The Gemara says, when you have a community, you have to make sure that within that community there's a structure for tzedakah. So you can anticipate, having done this, that very shortly the Gemara is going to say, okay, what is a community's responsibility to figure out their tzedakah mechanisms? So I'm going to say like this. What is for sure true here, right? This is a very long jump. I'm not making that jump right now to jump from here to social justice. But what is true is that the Gemara is clearly pointing, just even by way in which they place the two sugyot, there are two kinds of tzedakah in the world. I mean, there are two modes of operation that both have to exist. One is an interpersonal tzedakah, and one is a communally organized, community-based tzedakah that's helping people. That is not about having the rabbi and the community check who's legitimate for you to give your personal tzedakah. That's not what this is about. This is about what are our communal obligations and how we play them out. We're going to see, right, there's a kupa and a tamchui, they're communal institutions through which you can make that happen. I'm going to try to read one more story before calling it a day. No time is up. So the Gemara Ketubot raises the following, tells the following story. This is in Ketubot, and then it becomes referenced here. Mar Ukba have Anya b'shivavute. Mar Ukba, he's the person. Have Anya b'shivavute. There was a poor person in his community. Dave ragil kol yoma deshadile arba zuzi b'tzinora dedasha. You know what I'm going to do? Do I have 5 more minutes? Mm-hmm. Can we do that? I'm actually going to change the order and turn the page for a second. Because here we can really start to think a little bit about the personal versus impersonal piece. Steven Pinker is a professor of psychology at Harvard, written lots of things, and he wrote an essay in the New York Times magazine a bunch of years ago. And that's, again, I'm asking you right now to shift gears again. Like our first thing was defining the terms, and the second thing was just kind of clarifying these two forms of tzedakah. Now we're finally getting to a little bit about the personal versus the impersonal, which is going to speak to what's the real goal of tzedakah. So Steven Pinker wrote like this. Which of the following people would you say is the most admirable? Mother Teresa, Bill Gates, or Norman Borlaug? And which do you think is the least admirable? For most people, it's an easy question. Mother Teresa, famous for ministering to the poor in Calcutta, has been beatified by the Vatican, awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and ranked in an American poll as the most admired person of the 20th century. Bill Gates, infamous for giving us the Microsoft dancing paperclip and the blue screen of death, has been decapitated in effigy in I Hate Gates websites and hit with a pie in the face. As for Norman Borlaug, who the heck is Norman Borlaug? Yet a deeper look might lead you to rethink your answers. Borlaug, father of the Green Revolution, that used agricultural science to reduce world hunger, has been credited with saving 1 billion lives, more than anyone else in history. Gates, in deciding what to do with his fortune, crunched the numbers and determined that he could alleviate the most misery by fighting everyday scourges in the developing world like malaria, diarrhea, and parasites. Mother Teresa, for her part, extolled the virtue of suffering and ran her well-financed missions accordingly. Their sick patrons were offered plenty of prayer but harsh conditions, few analgesics, and dangerously primitive medical care. It's not hard to see why the moral reputations of this trio should be so out of line with the good they have done. Mother Teresa was the very embodiment of saintliness, white-clad, sad-eyed, ascetic, and often photographed at the wretched of the earth. Gates, as the nerd's nerd and the world's richest man, is likely to enter heaven as a proverbial camel squeezing through the needle's eye. And Borlaug, now 93, is an agronomist who has spent his life in labs and nonprofits, seldom walking into the media stage and hence into our consciousness at all. I doubt these examples will persuade anyone to favor Bill Gates over Mother Teresa for sainthood, but they show that our heads can be turned by an aura of sanctity, distracting us from a more objective reckoning of the actions that make people suffer or flourish. It seems we may all be vulnerable to moral illusions, the ethical equivalent of the bending lines that trick the eye in cereal boxes and psychology textbooks. You think so? So a good friend of, a great scholar who is an acquaintance, not a good friend of mine. He's a great guy. His name is Gary Anderson. Gary Anderson is a professor of Bible, Christian, kind of ancient Christianity. He is one of those Catholic scholars at Notre Dame who learns Gemara, reads Tanakh and Mishnah and Hebrew and things like that. He's a really neat. So he quotes this in the introduction to his thing, and as a Catholic is really offended. Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Anybody want to defend? Anybody want to help Gary Anderson?
No.
Yeah.
The element of personal sacrifice, I think, is not as balanced. She gives a lot more of herself.
Anything about personal sacrifice matter or no? You're the lone voice.
But I could, poverty being Jesus-like, in terms of, I guess it comes back to her self-sacrifice also.
It's also, just to try to take the edge off, maybe, it's like a little extreme. When I read, it's not fair, because I read that and then say, can anybody defend against that? But can you be charitable to it without kind of championing just having nothing, living in the streets and something like that? It's what's the kind of that, well, whatever, yeah. I'm not saying it should be Mother Teresa.
But that's exactly the point of social justice, which is we all have nothing. We're all equal. Mother Teresa has nothing and her people have nothing. Bill Gates has something and everyone else has nothing, and that's not fair. Even if he's willing to give it away, it's not equal, so it's not fair. Because he still has more than we do. I'm making the point of, that would be Anderson, speaking on behalf of the social justice movement, saying, what I don't like about the Bill Gates
Who are you talking
model,
about?
You said
My
she was
Anderson?
the issue.
Yes.
No, he's a religious man.
that's not the point. The point
No,
is,
actually, I'm sorry to interrupt. It actually is the point, because you jumped to say that he's got a social justice agenda, and I'm going to put, it's important to note that he does not have a social justice agenda. Actually, I don't know what his agenda is, but as a Catholic in Notre Dame, there's a good chance that he might not have a social justice agenda.
I'm not saying yes, I'm saying he's agreeing
He's
with
basically saying you're
social
missing
justice.
something very important about what it means to give. He's missing something very important about what it means to give. And part of what we're going to have to, which is?
What personal
Personal,
connection
what it
involved
does for you.
Well, the two things that you just said, both of which are important. I can't give like Bill Gates. I can't give like Bill Gates. For 97% of the people, for 99% of the people in the world, what role does what it means to you that I am there, what role does that play? And what role does it play for me that I am together with you in making that thing happen? Now, it's not a question that for somebody who can do what Bill Gates does, that's pretty enormous. And you know what that does for us?
Nothing.
It makes us putter. That's what it does. Because I can't do that, so I don't do anything. So it's not a question of whether what Bill, I'm going to keep on trying to get that not every text that we're reading should be like read with is this on the social justice side or not on the social justice side? You got to break it down a little bit and be able to say what he's pointing to is there's a reason actually, and a really good reason why people are inspired by Mother Teresa and in a certain kind of way. And you can get rid of you put somebody else in that place that you can imagine. The self-sacrifice on behalf of others, the personal connection and caring for other people, and what that means both for the personal moral development of the individual and the people around that individual, and what it means to the people on the receiving end, is a factor that gets swallowed up, especially in an environment where there are a couple of people who really know a ton. So that does not lead to social justice
I
immediately.
don't get that even. If I had cholera and Bill Gates' serum helped me get better, why would I care whether his hands were dirty or clean? If I would rather his serum than Mother Teresa washing my feet if I'm gonna die her way and live his way.
I agree with that. So would I. I'd rather get that than die. Is that the end of the discussion? There's
No,
nothing
but
else
I
to
don't
talk about?
understand it. I don't know, get what
Somebody
you're
else?
saying.
Anybody
It's
wanna-
how
anybody
it's
wanna
what
help?
it might inspire the rest of the world to do. So as to your point, we can identify with what Mother Teresa can do in a way where it's harder to give in the way that Gates
But
gives.
why? You would say to me logically that if we mimicked Bill Gates and gave the proportion that he gave, if we did that, we would be wonderful too.
If
What
it-
proportion?
if it had an
proportion.
impact.
His is having an impact.
His does, but what our proportion might be
Right.
may
What's
not
it?
have an impact, except on how we feel personally.
One second,
Not
these
on-
are two, I feel like these are two, you went this way and there's a this way.
Sorry.
No, because
Why wouldn't Anderson
I just want to say that
say-
the idea, there are two different things going on here. One is, if we all gave that proportion, is there enough to go around so there's no poverty in the world? The answer is yes. Whether we should force that or not force that through government is a question, in which people are fighting it. That's also true. No, but that's that line of questioning. There's another line of questioning which actually impacts on us on a much more daily and regular basis. And I would, which is, what is the role of personal interactions around giving, which we don't have. I'll say it as a principal and as a parent, right? As a principal and as a parent. Do I think that my kids might be raised that in case they make lots of money, they should give lots of that money to charity? I actually believe that they might have that idea. Are my children raised enough that they should take out of their time to be able to visit the person next door, to be able to actually, if there's somebody who's in, how many times did they see me seeing a poor person and grunting that I don't have money or I can't give right now, as opposed to, what the Gemara is going to say is that if you don't have money to give to somebody, you should be mefaiso b'dvarim. You should say something kind to. Do I do that? Have I been like a model around stuff like that? All I'm saying is the Gemara is raising another dimension. There's a story here that we're trying to get to, which we're not going to get to today, so I guess we're going to get to it next time. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you.